toward quorum.
I do not count
Toward quorum.
I do not count
Wonder how come it's so quiet there?
Did we lose this? I lost the screen.
Yeah. Yeah, it's because I was muted. That's why it's quiet.
Thank you, Dave. My name is Paul Hogan. I'm chairing tonight's Growth Planning Committee meeting. This is the November 16th, 2021 Growth Planning Committee meeting. We have 3 members here today, 2 others in addition to myself. Janet, you can introduce yourself.
Yes, hi, Janet Powell, Secretary.
And Jim.
Music man.
And we have Werner, who's our staff liaison with the town. Thank you, Werner. And Tom Morgan and Liz Durfee, who are our consultants helping us with the comp plan. Someone's got a...
Yeah, I got to disconnect because I lost the video. I have no clue what happened to the video. I'll disconnect and my family's talking, so I'm sorry. I'll join back on.
Could everybody, we have some guests as well, I see on the list. Could everybody mute themselves unless you're going to talk, and so that we don't have feedback. If tonight we're continuing on our future land use chapter draft, if people in the audience have comments or questions, they're welcome to post them to the chat or can they raise their hands in a... No, they just post them to the chat, right, Dave? I was just looking for, I see it. I was having trouble finding that on mine. Okay, so, right. Thank you, Dave. So we're going to lead off with continuing the review of that chapter. I just had a question on the agenda. If you looked at it online, there were 2 versions which you can link to it. One's the red line, one's the clean copy. Were there any changes since last week, or it's the same red line? That's what I thought. Okay. So there were changes we discussed last week, which have not been changed and are not incorporated into this. Who wants to start, and what page are we starting on? Let me go back.
I can start us off, and I'll pull a copy up on the screen and let you know what page we're going to be on. Well,
Sea level rise, Liz, right?
yeah, I'm just, it's not showing me the options for sharing my screen, so I'm just trying to figure out what is going on here.
Okay. Anyways, that's page 29 in the draft.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah.
Tom, do you have the option to
Share the screen?
Yeah, my files aren't showing up.
I guess I do. So I'll put.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Okay, I'll get future land use
Why?
up there.
It's very strange.
And take me a minute to pull it up.
$28 is in non-residential land uses, right? We just started that.
But do we
gonna
have
start this-
non-residential?
Oh, that's 27. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I think we're starting the sea level rise section, if I'm remembering correctly. And I apologize, for some reason I'm not able to share anything right now.
That's page 30, sea level rise. I had a question when I was looking. I may as well ask it while you're searching.
Mhm.
Yeah, go ahead. Let's see.
It was on 28 in the non-residential land uses, and it said below your chart 1811, there was a statement that 22% of the new construction permits for commercial were in the Goose Rocks beach zone, which struck me as being impossible.
I'll bring that sheet up right now, Paul. I'm on that right now. So let's see.
If you're trying to ignore that, if you're trying to.
Oh, no, they're only 2 pages apart.
No, I mean, okay. Yeah,
Is
yeah.
it big enough? I'm going to make it bigger now.
No, it's perfect.
Okay,
Great.
cool. Okay. So you're talking about this little slice of the pie here, right?
Mhm.
Right. And the text below it.
Werner, do you have any input on how that might appear? So we have it's the non-residential permit information.
Yeah, so I think what I'd probably want to take a look at the spreadsheet and maybe how those got classified. Because I would agree with that. I mean, you know, I'm not sure what would have wound up in that, you know, in the commercial permitting, activity for Goose Rocks.
Okay. We can take a look at that. Thanks for flagging that, Paul.
Yeah.
There's kind of a prohibition on new commercial uses in the Goose Rock zone as part of the beach use agreement. So it would be strange.
How long has that been in effect for?
It was signed in like 13, 8 years,
Okay.
something like that. 13, 14.
Yeah. I mean, this might jive for, it wouldn't surprise me if this was relative to permits, just generally speaking,
Right.
permits being issued. That wouldn't surprise me because it's kind of a breakout, but not commercial, not commercial new construction.
Yeah, that number was just above in the text. There was a graph that showed Goose Rocks as leading, I think, in the number of permits. I can't.
Yeah.
I forgot what page.
So Liz, if you want to send me, what you're using for data there for that.
I will, yeah. I think this
that
information
pie chart.
I think it's in the land use chapter 2. So I will go back and look at that in the land use chapter and look at the calculations again, and I can send you what we were looking for. I'm trying to look at it right now, and I feel like I'm not going to find it really quickly.
We can go on then, back to.
Commercial new construction, I think, was the description.
Right.
Yeah.
So
So we can take a look at that and make sure
Yep.
we're interpreting that correctly.
Yeah, you and I can work through that offline and figure out what that wants to look like.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that seems high for Goose Rocks, the 22% for commercial.
Well, there just really aren't commercial uses.
Right. Yeah,
Well,
I mean,
I thought this was made to refer to like, the campground or something. I don't know if that is part of Goose Rocks. The one Tim Harrington owned.
yeah,
I don't know.
yeah. I mean, that's
Or even another hidden pond or something.
right. And that's the thing. It would be, I guess that's the question. We just have to look at how the permits are classified and what it is that we're trying to show, with this.
Do you pull a building permit to put down a mobile home trailer, whatever those things are called?
So no, the park models are
Park models. Thank you.
Yeah, they don't get a permit for those, but there are.
Right. That's what I thought.
And the thing is that the campground, all that activity, the permits that we issued in there, that would have jumped in this category. I mean, those were issued a couple of years ago. So, but this is this is 09 to 19. So this is a 10-year, we're looking at 10 years worth of activity. It could also be that some of that might be resorted Goose Rocks renovation activity that would have happened in that time.
But this says This is new construction permits. So
yeah,
if you're renovating a bar or something like that,
right, yeah, and this wouldn't have picked up the renovations to those buildings out in the front for resort at Goose Rocks. So yeah, let's take a look at that, and we'll tweak that as needed. So the codes have also changed a little bit over the years. So that could be throwing some of this off too.
Is this a start of non-residential land uses? So the definition is we're looking at commerce here. Is that defined the non-residential land use?
Non-residential land use would be everything that's not like a home, basically.
Right. So that poses the questions where, and just from my own curiosity, where does like the land trust fall in on this? Like
well, this is just permit this is just permit activity, and that would
Okay, I'm just looking. Yeah, I see it. Okay.
Yeah. So in the I think in the land use chapter, we have a map that's looking at how parcels are classified based on whether they are commercial or residential, and like the whole area of each parcel is colored in according to, if there's a home on it, it's colored for residential. And there are, I think there's a category for some of the exempt land. And so in that map, you could see things like, I think we have land that's designated for like the open space land, the tree growth land that is categorized differently for tax purposes. But in this short section in this chapter here, we're not looking at like the area of land except for that first sentence there. It's just looking at permits that are distributed. So it doesn't account for or get into, it doesn't really relate to the conservation.
Right. Yep. Thank you.
But that's a good question. Yeah. So this pie chart at least is really just looking at the number of different types of permits that are issued townwide that weren't for homes. And again, obviously we'll go back and make sure that we have that those numbers correct.
So one thing that I thought about when we were talking about the solar farms is, if we take into consideration, a large area, maybe there's not buildings on it, but it just strikes me as, should we be considering some other economic opportunities where a business with a smaller footprint wants to, set up shop and is employing, local people. I don't know if that's something we'd consider or not, I mean, if the benefit of having a solar array is there, but I don't want to forego the opportunity to consider another business that we take into consideration, again, they want to set up shop, they're going to employ people, and their footprint is significantly smaller, and maybe they'll do things like, again, put solar panels on the roof and do these other things that, would, offset whatever they're doing for business.
Well, you're not precluding one over the other. You're just saying
You can do both. Yeah.
you can do both. And the only comment in the solar area was that we didn't have any, our town land use really said nothing about them, and we should consider perhaps having design standards so that, they don't appear right on the edge of the town forest, or they don't appear on Goose Rocks Road, places which are local vistas, for example. They would want to preserve. You might not want to see solar panels all the way out to the edge of the road. You might require, shrubbery, small trees or something to not be looking at all that glass.
Yeah. So Jim, the intent here is to give the property owner an option to go either way or both. And it's really
Right.
Up to the discretion of the property owner what they want to do out there.
Right. So within a certain area. So do we give the same discretion for somebody that wants to set up shop to do another business?
Well, we haven't really gone as far as saying what area of town. I think that what we would probably want to include as a recommendation in this plan is to research and develop an ordinance for the land use regulations, and at that point you would identify either zoning districts that a large-scale solar array would be permitted in, or if you want to create sort of a separate overlay district where they are allowed, or if you want to allow them town-wide. That would probably be the point when you think about where they do and do not belong. So we haven't gone that far with the solar ordinance, or any other specific types of uses, with the exception of some of the uses that folks identified in, for example, this table that shows up on your screen now. During our workshop, Tom and I then went and looked at the current language in your ordinance that either allows or doesn't allow some of these types of uses. But the intent is not to say this land could only be used for solar and not another type of use. It's really, as Tom mentioned, to just open the door for a property owner if that's something that they want to do on their property.
Yeah, that's what I guess that's what, I want to make sure that that's there. I mean, I think is, Paul mentioned too, did we put in wording for, the opportunities for farming?
We noted it, but we haven't made any changes since the last meeting. So you're still looking at the same document that we had on the screen last time.
Yeah.
But we were going to include some language just to reflect the importance of farms in Kennebunkport.
I heard a very interesting piece on NPR this morning in Morning Edition. Tom, I think you'd be interested. It was a farm in California, a couple 100 acres, 5th generation or something like that. And the farm just wasn't able to make it. And they took a big gamble and they decided to have solar cohabit with farming. And he diversified what he's growing. And he just finished his first year. He was able to farm the place with half of the water he had used in previous years, which is a big issue in California because the shade that is provided by the panels kept the water from leaving the farm so rapidly. And the guy was just like saying, my neighbors all thought I was crazy, but now they're all looking at me like,
Yeah, no, and that I've heard other stories about how the farmers are embracing solar and using it in imaginative ways that way.
And he was planting right underneath, right next to it, designing his rows. The whole thing was designed for his continued farming, not just abandoning farming for solar.
When Liz and I were working for the city of Saco a couple, 3 years ago, I had some conversations with the local farmers on just that topic. Because it's particularly the larger farms in Saco. It's a lot of hard work, and they're not making a lot of money. And these guys are seeing what their options are.
All right, let's move on.
Okay, done with this page, then, huh?
Yeah, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that we went through the non-residential land uses at our last meeting. Or did we not?
I thought we did. Yeah.
I think we did.
You guys see anything you haven't seen before here?
I think we did.
Yep.
All right.
Okay.
And we're ready to talk about the sea rising.
Okay.
Yep.
I do see a chat comment. Oh, it's just a woot woot. Okay. So the sea level rise section kind of summarizes some of the content from other chapters. And we've highlighted some of the recommendations from the Maine Climate Council, which provide recommendations to commit to managing and plan for managing specific sea level rise scenarios by the year 2050 and 2100. So we've used that data with some mapping layers that have been produced by the Maine Geological Survey. And that's what you can see in the map here. And summarized, again, some of the findings from the other chapter, the area of land that's impacted by sea level rise. You can see the extent of the high tide is shown in that blue. And so all of the colored layers that extend further inland beyond that blue color are those different sea level rise scenarios with the magenta showing the highest sea level rise scenario of 8.8 feet by the year 2100. And that's the planning threshold that the Maine Climate Council is recommending that municipalities and the state look at. So a lot of this land is located within the Shoreline Protection Overlay District, which doesn't necessarily contain regulations that protect from sea level rise, like elevating structures, for example. But it does contain some regulations and measures that limit the amount of development that occurs in vulnerable areas. But there are areas of town. Tom, do you mind forwarding like 2 pages? I think the map with
Can we go back? Oh. Well, it's fine here. My comment was related to the consolidated school, which was, on both of those pages, it shows, you say it's anticipated, but in fact, last week it flooded, and it flooded, dozens and dozens and dozens of cars when that school was the escape place during hurricane, like in 76, 77, I'm told. Mm-hmm. And my neighbor, I think I told the story once before, my neighbor who wouldn't leave the house, finally got there. There was no parking available in the field, so they were forced to go way up the hill. And when they looked out the next morning, all the cars were flooded who were in the field. Mm. And his car was safe up on the hill for having procrastinated. Procrastination works about half the time.
I think the answer here, Paul, is what this map shows is just flooding that's caused by a rising sea.
Well, this is rising sea because it comes in. Look at your 2 pages ahead. Okay. I mean, I wish Jim was here because he saw it last week, I'm sure.
This page or the next one?
One more. This one, which shows it coming in, and then you have that red mark around the school, which is HHT.
That's the projection for, that's the worst case projection for the year 2100. So what's happening now is different than what's on the map.
So how do we account for that if it happened last week?
Well,
And it
was it
happened-
coming from the creek or was it coming from somewhere else?
I believe the creek, but I'm not positive.
Hey,
Isn't that a whole draw that goes down? I mean, it's a draw that goes down from the hill and from on the other side of the road.
yeah.
That's the way the water moves.
So a lot of it, so from Consolidated, the area that's around Consolidated is that you have, you've got a watershed that comes down more from the Wilds District Road area, that comes and actually drains down underneath the sewer department, so there's drainage features that come underneath there. So there's, you have some, storm input that comes in through the storm drainage that runs, for all practical purposes, there's a fair amount of stormwater infrastructure underneath Recreation Way that then makes its way out to, the creek there. So I think you've got a couple of different things there. Plus you've got, coming down off of School Street, you've got, everybody knows the topography there, right? So you've got a fair amount of just sheet flow that comes down the hills, that comes down through, McCabe, the McCabe property, comes down, it's basically Consolidated. It's at the bottom of the hill, so
does the water come up through the stormwater drains that are down by Consolidated?
No, I don't think it comes, I don't think it comes up through, the storm drains. But I think what you have is all I'm saying is that you have more than just what's entering into the catch basins there on the property, right?
Of course.
Then there's more than just what's going into the catch basins. There's already stormwater, in infrastructure beneath those catch basins, I guess is my point. So, it's one of those things that in future years, the sizing of that has to be looked at for sure. But
So it's more storm events as opposed to sea level rise.
well, at some point, and I think what'll wind. You're right. Yes. So the short answer is that those are storm event
Which are getting worse.
related, but if your outlet point becomes inundated,
Right.
then you'll have
It's not going
then it's not going anywhere.
Right.
It's gonna go
and
somewhere. It's just not going to go through there.
It's going to go into school.
And
Open the doors.
I would just also add that it's sea level rise is already happening and high tides are already higher than they were. So I wouldn't say that flooding is, even if you experience it now, is not necessarily attributable to sea level rise. I don't think you would be likely to see anything close to 8.8 feet of sea level rise, tomorrow. These maps I think are good planning tools because they show you the areas that are vulnerable in the future, and a lot of areas may be flooding currently, especially the areas that are vulnerable to those lower sea level rise scenarios.
Yeah.
So we continue to plan accordingly, much like the which chapter is it? The hazard mitigation.
Mm-hmm.
We build higher, or
Right. Yeah. So when you build, if you have to rebuild the school, either look at a different location, look at how flooding can be reduced in other areas so that it doesn't extend that far inland, or elevate the structure.
Yeah, that other map you showed, Liz, I think it was down towards. Yeah, again, I think that actually the hazard mitigation shows the place that's on probably 8 feet high on the marsh. So, we encourage that and plan accordingly.
Yeah, and one other thing to keep in mind is you can see in the two bottom maps that there's a tan color and a kind of a reddish purple. They're both projections for the year 2100. This is the Maine Climate Council is projecting this. And what the Climate Council advises is if you have critical infrastructure such as a sewer pump station, you got to plan for 8.8 because that's the worst case scenario. You don't want to get caught by surprise. But if it's just like property that's less critical, then you can plan for the 10 color, which is 3.9 feet. So when you're discussing the school, you decide is that critical or not. You can make the case either way. Certainly the sewer system's critical.
80 years from now, can you imagine? Wow, they probably have the technology. Who knows?
All right, sorry, Liz, I diverted you. I was just trying to reconcile that paragraph with today's reality.
No, I think that's a good reminder. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight in the map showing the consolidated school was that while you have, and we could even add the floodplain or the 100-year floodplain boundaries to this map too, to show that there are existing regulations that limit development around water bodies, but sea level rise is going to extend out of those boundaries, and it may be necessary to look at something like an overlay district, which has come up in some of the recommendations from other efforts that Kennebunkport and the region have been involved in, is potentially considering, do you need an overlay district, which is essentially a second set of regulations that are tied to a specific area of town, not your main zoning district, so not Dock Square, but something similar to a shoreland zone, which apply in designated areas. Do you need to look at having something like a sea level rise or a coastal hazard overlay in order to minimize the impacts of sea level rise on development and make sure that new development and redevelopment adhere to certain standards to help minimize risk in the future to those properties?
I think it's important as you look at that and talk about that, to also keep in mind the average age of the infrastructure that you're dealing with. And we've talked a little bit about that when, specifically talking about pump stations on, when you look at a pump station and you're planning on, 25, 30 year lifespan for it, you plan for those time frames and projected rises that you would have within those time frames, knowing that, the next iteration of technology and the next iteration of pump station is going to be designed differently, at that point. And I think that's probably a worthwhile conversation as well when you're dealing with, the ages, and the lifespans of other structures as well.
Yeah, I think an overlay district, makes sense in terms of helping people to understand the future and let them assess the risk. If they don't have the information, I got a call 10 days ago. Someone's considering knocking down this house and building another one. They said, how do I find out what's going to happen to this place, this particular area? And I was like, well, you can go here and you can go here and you could go look at this, and, trying to guide him to make an educated decision. An overlay district, to show, no, you're 8 feet higher than, the shoreland zone, which extends 250 feet. So you're not in an overlay district. You can, rest easy. Or in fact, it's flat, for a quarter mile. So you may be impacted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think part of the challenge is that a lot of people don't know that they need to look to see where their structure or their home may be vulnerable. At least in my experience, a lot of the communities that I'm working with that are in areas that are already impacted quite a bit by flooding, people are buying houses and they're not aware of the potential risk. And so I guess that's an argument for making sure that there are some standards for development and new development to help, protect the future homeowner that doesn't know that they have to go figure out if their house is vulnerable to sea level rise.
Got it. Go ahead, Jim. Sorry.
I think it makes sense to put this in even for a suggestion, especially with the cost of flood insurance. I mean, if you're building a place and you build it 4 feet off the ground, but there's also things, and Warner can attest to this, when you build a place, there's the standards of how high you can go as well. So there's, building it up doesn't mean you can have 3 stories unless the fire code dictates you can go over, 35 feet? So it changes things. So it's good to have the suggestion and allow people to methodically think about what they want to build if it's new construction.
Yeah, well, talking about it from a practical perspective, if let's say that you had an overlay that, that dealt with sea level rise, maybe one of the things that you have, within something like that. And I think, so just to be clear, comp plan should just, have the language that encourages the development of something like this. But, for example, we've all seen how many times, the fire department gets called out, to pump people's basements, and so, maybe what you wind up having is that if you're within an area that's going to be subject to sea level rise, maybe having a basement in those areas doesn't make a lot of sense. Maybe you wind up with some type of performance standards that, if a home's going to be rebuilt, within an area that's subject to sea level rise, then, you have something like that, maybe some, like limitations on basements and utility placements and things like that, that we see, your volunteers and your staff dealing with on a regular basis, but I think the basement flooding thing is that's a regular one that, that we hear. Something like that would also minimize, we know that folks put their sump pump drainage into the sewer, which they're not supposed to, but we know it happens just because you see the numbers spike at the plant, a couple days after a storm event, you see the numbers spike. So it's not all coming in through the, it's not all filtering in through the manholes, like it's, some of that's coming in, from sump discharges, and that really messes with the sewer, just the chemistry at the sewer department. Like you really don't want, people really shouldn't be doing that because that really throws everything off. So, those are just a couple of things that, as we're talking about this, that I think about, for, potential future standards for something like that.
There are a couple of quick comments in the chat. I'm going to read. Stephanie says, protecting existing wetlands will also ease in flooding. Can't prioritize development on low-lying areas that pool water, need to preserve this habitat. Someone said, totally agree with Stephanie. And another person said, agree, wetlands and non-developed lands and the shoreline wetlands areas are becoming important defenses against the losses that will not come back once developed. Thank you for those comments.
Hey, Paul.
A great point.
Hey, Paul, do you have any, I know you're from New Jersey. After that hurricane, do you know if there was like standards for like, rebuilding and like, not putting in basements and they were so high? Do you know anything?
Yeah, it varied all over the state, and it's, some towns, nothing got even rebuilt for 5 years 5 or 10 years, because they couldn't agree with the state on what should be done.
Okay.
So yes, you had to elevate primarily along the shore.
Right.
In other communities, I think the flood program, Werner would probably know this, but there are, standards. If more than 50% of the property value was lost, then you have to do certain things. That's all part of FEMA's. I don't know any of what those rules are, but I know they exist.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah, so there are, that's a good point though, Paul. There are standards for, development within the floodplain overlay district now that aren't entirely different than standards you might want to include in a coastal hazard overlay. I think one of the differences is that your existing floodplain, the extent of that area that is the extent of the land area that falls within your 100-year floodplain doesn't totally align with the extent of the area that is potentially impacted by sea level rise. Right. So it's just an opportunity to look at where are those other areas that are not, regulated under the floodplain ordinance, but also may require, structures to be elevated, new structures or substantial improvement, that sort of thing. So.
Yeah.
I'd like to.
It's the difference between a planning document and a regulatory document. Your flood maps are regulatory. That the data that's used to build those maps, is built off of modeling that looks, that basically looks back at previous events. It's modeling, from all of your storm events that have occurred, as opposed to a projected kind of look forward.
And someday,
go ahead, Liz.
Tom, would you mind jumping back one page? I don't know if we cover everything. This isn't a very long chapter, and we've already kind of talked about most issues. Maybe one more page. Okay, so that was the beginning. So we referenced some of the discussion from the transportation chapter, and there's a copy of that map again that shows the different road segments that will are anticipated to be impacted by sea level rise under different scenarios, which is another important thing for the town to kind of keep revisiting is looking at what areas of town may be cut off or impacted even temporarily by road flooding, and where is the infrastructure itself vulnerable. We talked a little bit about how sea level rise will actually cause groundwater rise, likely in areas that have wetlands first, but can also extend up to a few miles inland. It's difficult to know where groundwater rise will occur, but it's another challenge that coastal areas will face in the future. And then as that groundwater does rise, it brings along another set of challenges that we talked about, I think, in the water resources chapter, related to the groundwater levels interfacing with septic systems, causing saltwater intrusion in wells, and also impacting pavements. So a whole host of problems to keep in mind, when you're thinking about your next long-term planning efforts.
Hey, the jigsaw puzzle is more complicated than it was last time around, huh?
And I think that's good. We have this map, I think, in the hazards chapter that just shows the 3 different sea level rise scenarios that the State Climate Council is recommending managing and planning for. You can scroll ahead a couple of pages, Tom, if you don't mind. Thank you. Here's that roadmap again. And then we just sort of summarized some of the ongoing work the town's been a part of, the coalition with 6 towns in York County as part of the Regional Sustainability and Resilience Program. The town has a set of climate change goals, which we will add a link to. We did poll workshop participants about what they thought the town should do to reduce impacts of sea level rise and flooding. And top responses included regulations to discourage new development in areas that are likely to be impacted by sea level rise, prohibiting town-owned structures in locations that are vulnerable to flooding or sea level rise, and increasing stormwater design standards, which is a measure that will help mitigate impacts of extreme precipitation as well. And that input really did align with some other recommendations that came out of some work from the Planning and Development Commission, which also included measures like looking at creation of a coastal hazard overlay and prohibiting municipal funds from being used for development in existing and future flood hazard areas. And I think that's the end of that section. Remembering correct. Oh, here's your polling results here. And then if we end up changing the boundary of the growth area, we'll update this map. But this is just to highlight the areas that are vulnerable in the growth areas. And that obviously includes Dock Square. And Tom and I have mentioned the need to think about the future, the long-term future of Dock Square. And I guess we're curious if the planning committee wants anything noted in the comprehensive plan to that effect of maybe a study, vulnerability assessment, or more research to look at impacts to Dock Square, but also potential other locations in town that could support your sort of cultural and commercial center.
It is what it is. Build higher. That's what I think.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and that's certainly something that's potentially on the table for a lot of areas.
Yeah, I think that area just draws people just because it's down near the water, and I think it's to completely consider a forklift center that it is somewhere else is I don't know. Mm-hmm. But
yeah, we've talked a lot about the importance of Dock Square for economic reasons, but also it is one of your sort of scenic resources and really contributes to a portion of the character of the town too. So I understand your point. It's not necessarily a replaceable asset.
Warner, I have a question for you regarding the Silver Jackets. Has anything transpired with that? The application for them to do some assessment for the town?
Yes. So we were accepted, by the Silver Jacket program. So it's in the sense that it covers, Dock Square and Lower Village, so it'll be a collaborative effort between the two towns in the Silver Jacket group.
Could you explain what that is, Werner? Silver Jacket?
Yeah, so essentially what it is it's a program that's run by the Army Corps of Engineers, and so it's primarily a lot of their staff, their expertise, that comes in and looks in an area, and provides some assessments and recommendations in terms of things that, property owners and the towns can consider and look at doing, for areas, like Dock Square that are vulnerable to sea level rise and coastal flooding. So what it is that we get the benefit of their technical expertise in looking at a specific location.
Mm-hmm.
So at this point right now, we're waiting to hear back from them as far as the schedule being set. So we know we've been, we know we've been accepted, but now it's just a matter of, since it's their resources, they get to set the schedule. So
Werner, how long does an assessment take,
That's a good question. I think, without the document in front of me, I think it's a process that I expect to take. Well, I mean, it's not more than a year. It's probably I would assume it's in a 6 to 8 month time frame.
Mhm.
I was out on Victoria on Vancouver Island right before COVID, and they have an entire dock square on floats. So you go through, into the tourist area, and you walk the whole area, the entire area. It's probably as big as Dock Square, filled with restaurants you mostly eat outside, but shops and everything, same kind of stuff that we have downtown. And the whole thing is on floats. Each shop is on a separate float, and you're bouncing around, walking from shop to shop, from a central area into somebody's business, which is a separate float, a barge essentially, I guess they were.
Oh, is that a new development, or has that been?
No, it looks like it's been there. I think it was an old, fishing area. It's right in downtown Victoria. Every tourist walks there and, goes at least one night.
That might be a solution for Dock Square.
It's not it sounds far-fetched to us, at the moment thinking of it, but I don't think it's too far outside of reality that that you have something like that that could occur. I do think, the Dock Square discussion, is more than just the shops. I mean, it's Route 9 as well. What does that look like in terms of, there's a lot of traffic that comes down through there. I know we've talked about that piece of it. And how much of, I think there obviously needs to be, inclusion of DOT in that discussion.
Right. And whatever option the town comes up with, it's going to be, I think it'd be critical to make sure you do it across the board for every property in Dock Square all at the same time, because otherwise it'd be kind of chaotic,
Yeah, it is definitely a practical. I've probably spent more time thinking about it than I want to admit to, but it is one of those kind of practical issues. Like, what do you do? Like, you jack one building up but not the one next to it, and and how does that work? And what is
very well.
Yeah, like, what does the streetscape want to look like? And
So
how
should
do
we
keep it ADA?
So should we reference here? The question from Tom and Liz is, what should we say? So should we reference, we're taking baby steps with the application to the Army Corps to, is that what we should say at this point?
Well, I wouldn't say baby steps, and I know that you don't really want us to write that, but I think it's a really, good, great first step, or not even first step, that the town is taking. So we could definitely reference that study. Mention that you'll see what the findings are from that project, and I'm sure you'll have a set of recommendations and needs based on the information that you gather in that project.
And by 2030, we're going to know a lot more about how accelerating this is, whether we're going to be looking at the low end or the high end, And you might have to do some serious planning at that point.
Yeah, and I just saw one of the comments about what you do about parking after raising structures, which is a great point. I think one of the challenges with talking about raising structures is that you have to raise the roads too in order to access those structures. And then, parking areas, assuming you keep those parking areas, they would have to be elevated as well, or built in a way that not all levels of a parking structure, for example, would be accessible depending on the tide or something like that.
Take the cost-effective approach. Don't park down there when there's a storm coming.
I have a couple of more comments in the chat, which my mother did not send in. It says, getting creative is a good idea with water rise. I like Paul's idea. And then another person said, no one wants to think of significant ongoing flooding in Dock Square. However, the map's indicated that is what we're looking at. So a plan drafted on how to handle it, building higher, building differently. Ultimately, relocation seems crucial and getting ahead of it. Being creative about it are potential opportunities, as Mr. Hogan just indicated. Important to think outside the box. Unfortunately, the water is coming. Thanks for thinking about this.
I think it makes sense to reference the study.
Great.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, we know it's coming. It's that we've been told. So
This is a new picture. Get you thinking.
Yeah.
Gonna be all boat restaurants in 10 years.
Okay. So does that wrap it up for that chapter?
That,
You stopped sharing the screen, so I assume that is what you were.
Oh no, I was switching screens here.
let me catch up. I'm on a
No,
different-
we had some more to do in this chapter.
So the portion,
Oh, right.
so let me make sure I'm looking at the right areas. So we could probably skip over this portion for right now. Tom, do you want to maybe do the waterfront
Sure.
area first, and then we'll come back to that
Okay.
summary area?
All right.
Chapter's a little out of order right now.
Ready to talk about the waterfront?
Sure, thanks.
Sure. Yeah. You know what? One thing Liz and I have been hearing for 2 years is the community is very committed to protecting the commercial fishing industry. And no, I'm impressed. I think it's genuine. And
No. Somebody just put in the chat. I'm so sorry. I read it, and they called the town Kennebunkport.
That's your parking solution. Everybody bring their boats.
So, I think that's great, and it is impressive that the community stands behind that important industry in town, and particularly because it is such a history in town. But as a planner, I'm wondering, well, is the town ready for what might come around the corner? You've dealt successfully with the challenges that have come so far, but I'm thinking, what if a real estate that's along the water gets so valuable that you get a lot of pressure from big real estate developers from out of state who think they can make a lot of money building something big on the water. And it's the sort of thing that some other communities in Maine have been wrestling with. I think Portland's a good example of
Portland.
that. Yeah. So my question is Kennebunkport really prepared for that eventuality? And Werner, I'm hoping you're going to weigh in on this one too. I get the sense that the community's kind of complacent and says, well, this has worked good so far. But I'm wondering, are you going to be ready for if the pressure on the waterfront gets escalated? So that's a question I'm going to throw out to you right now.
So
We have a work. Go ahead, Warner.
it is the question. So let me just rephrase what I think I heard you ask. Is there concern that the town at some point would sell its working waterfront to a developer? Is that what I heard
Not
you
the
say?
public land. Obviously, the town-owned land won't get sold, but I mean,
Right.
part of the working waterfront is fishermen with access to water and moorings and docks and everything else. And when those start to disappear, maybe somebody with a lot of money will come in, and developer, and say, I'd like to buy your property. It's the type of thing that is happening in other communities in Maine, and it hasn't here yet. But do you see that as a possible threat? And if so, how can you head it off?
So I think, so what I see as potential areas to think about, and recognize that when people say working waterfront, you have to really define really what that is. So a lot of times folks think working waterfront, they hear working waterfront and they go, oh, that's, we're talking about Government Wharf, we're talking about, Cape Porpoise Pier. But, some will also, would technically call, the marinas also part of your working waterfront, right? Your commercial marinas. And so, the question is that, well, what happens when a commercial marina, when the market says highest and best use is no longer a marina, but maybe something else? I think is that what you're?
Oh yeah,
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, those waterfront properties, their potential for profitability from real estate development, residential. Will be greater than anything the fishing industry will ever.
But aren't we? I mean, most of our working waterfront like that, that we have at least, and I'll just speak specifically about the Kennebunk, the Kennebunk River. Most of that, you really don't have any building envelopes. The properties are, those portions are relatively narrow. All of that's going to fall within your setbacks. I think what you want to do is make sure that you have supportive language for setbacks for non-water dependent uses. You want to focus on saying that we just want, we want water dependent. If there's going to be a new structure, that's built and, not a replacement or a change of use, you really want to look hard and make sure that what you have there is a water dependent use, and not, for example, a hotel is not hotel's not a water dependent use. It doesn't, need the water to function, although, the folks that own them think that they do. But, so I think we're just making sure that those types of protections are in place, is important.
And do you think they are now?
Well, right now, if you're going to go through, well, let's just pick a property, for example.
The only marina we have left, we really only have one?
Oh, no, you've got a couple. No, you've got Chicks, you've got Kennebunkport, you got Kennebunkport Marina, and then you have...
Oh, there's the Arundel Yacht Club, the River Club.
Yeah, you've got the Yachtsman, so... With the swimming pool. So all of those, that you have there are, they're all well within 75, within that 75-foot setback. And so your current ordinance is, says that if you're going to have a structure, if you're going to have a new structure, so, we're not talking about grandfathered uses here, then it's got to be something that's water dependent. So it needs to be, in order for it to function, it needs to have access to the water. That's the big question. And that language is currently in place, but I do think it's important to continue to have that supportive language in the comp plan that says we want to make sure that our existing marinas, remain as marinas. We don't want to see them converted into a condominium project. Even though like that's, I don't see that.
Mhm.
But it doesn't mean that somebody doesn't come in and try, right?
Right.
And so you want that supportive language in your plan that,
Right.
that the town can rely on to defend its ordinance.
Mhm.
And no, we'll make sure we do that too. But it's not just the marinas I was thinking of. On a smaller scale, you have individual properties all along the shore, and some of them are commercial fishermen. They access the sea directly.
What are you suggesting that? Because I grew up in Phippsburg, and there's a lot of, it's very more rural than this, and there's a lot of people that own property right on the water, fishermen and stuff like that. So are you suggesting that if they sell that piece of property, we should somehow curtail somebody that just has money?
No, you're not.
Something different?
You're not curtailing it, really,
No,
because
we shouldn't be dictating what the market does. I wouldn't want to do that. That's still an investment to them.
in any real estate sale, it's up to the buyer, to
Right.
do their due diligence to find out what they can and what they can't do, and then they make their own decision, based on their due diligence. The issues that we see with property transfers are when folks don't do their due diligence, and ask those questions and know at least what the risks are. Folks get themselves into trouble when they speculate.
Right.
Yeah, there's a comment in the chat. In terms of residential becoming something residential with a lobsterman living there. It seems that's happened, a long time ago, and maybe continues to happen as real estate prices have gone up. The Cape Porpoise fishing industry has been impacted already. An example would be the silencing of Goat Island Lighthouse. I'm not sure what that comment means. I guess unless people are complaining, the newcomers who built their replacement homes or fixed up the houses are complaining about noise from the lighthouse. But, you really, with the comp plan, having a lobsterman sell his house to someone who's not going to be a lobsterman, but it's still a single family house, that's probably not something the comp plan can say much about, should say much about.
Well, and I think what you see in a lot of other coastal communities that don't have maybe a municipal pier.
Right.
I think that is that's a much bigger threat. If you don't have a municipal pier or a government wharf, then lobstermen selling their waterfront properties, that then become non-working waterfront properties. That's a concern, and that changes the character. But at the same time, they've got the right to sell their property. But I don't see that as much of an issue here because we have those protected areas for that industry.
Plus, you can't. Where we have, the zoning all along the coastline is basically single-family residential, no matter what zone you're in. Outside of, so you're not going to have somebody buy up 5 oceanfront properties and try to put a condominium there. It would not be permitted, I assume.
You'd have a fight on your hands, I'd say. I think you guys have answered my question, though. That was good information. And I think your point was particularly well taken. Is you have 2 municipal wharfs in town that are going to take a lot of the pressure off of that.
I think just to add on to that, we should definitely continue to encourage, that use for the commercial fishing, but, also, like the marinas that you referenced, if that ever changed, hands, we're also continuing to try to find ways, for boat landings and stuff like that, that's something we should look into as well, make sure that, we're making available for recreational, uses.
The comment
So-
that I did not understand has been clarified in the chat with the newcomers and noise. And the comment was that the foghorn at the Goat Island has now been silenced. You have to call in and get it to sound if you need it. You need help coming into the harbor if it's foggy. So I do not know how that got turned off or why that got turned off.
Interesting.
I think
Why would
ours,
they turn that off?
I think it's a cultural clash.
that's what it sounds like.
Definitely.
Well, I
love
think
waking
Jim
up.
had a good point about making sure that we're highlighting the importance of public access and, for recreational purposes too, when we're talking about waterfronts.
Absolutely.
So that's something we can note in here also.
Yeah, and I have one other question for Werner. When Liz and I were plowing through Chapter 208, we noticed there's a critical waterfront designation that is on the books, but very few communities in Maine have implemented it. And I was wondering what your take is. Would that be something to be useful or helpful in Kennebunkport, or should we pass on that one?
Critical waterfront. I don't know how much that's going to readily apply here in town. Are you talking about the current use programs?
You look on the screen. I don't know how well you can see it. This paragraph that's like in the middle on the second column.
Yep.
This is the exact language out of Chapter 208. It says current and proposed mechanisms, both regulatory and non-regulatory, to ensure that critical rural areas and critical waterfront areas are to the greatest extent practical protected from the impacts of incompatible development. So,
My understanding is it's like a growth area. It's another level. You can,
yes.
you could designate critical rural areas in addition to rural areas, and then also this waterfront. Yeah. And we sought out examples from Maine, and we're not able to get any information. The state couldn't provide information on other communities that had this layer either.
You guys could be the first.
My sense is that if it's any way similar to the working waterfront program, which is a tax program, there's likely some pretty heavy impacts as far as use. So it may vary. So in the tax program, you get a reduction in value for tax purposes. However, at the same time, you're also restricting the use of it, to whether it be a commercial or industrial waterfront use. And I think it's likely the reason why a lot of that's not super popular is because of just what we see the market doing, for waterfront properties. A lot of these types of areas, you have to also have you've got to have like a minimum acreage size, in order for them to be justifiable as a zone. And so, it could be that, that's, part of the reason why it's, why they're not super popular. You may have to designate a fairly decent sized area, to qualify in that. And, and if it strips out a fair amount of rights for property owners, then, that might be why it's not super popular, even though, it sounds like it's probably a decent tool to look at for, preserving a commercial aspect to the waterfront.
So what's the sense of the committee on this one? Is it something you prefer not to include in the plan, or is it, would you like to see something like this in the plan?
I would say that honestly, I'd like to look at it a little bit closer,
Agreed.
just to understand what it says, before either sticking a fork in it or saying, yep, we should do it. So.
Okay, no, that's fair.
Mhm.
Yeah,
I would
my
say,
I mean, on a larger level, it's places, I think, like in the Chesapeake Bay that have adopted critical waterfront areas. It's something I've heard of along coastal regions, but just not up here, not in Maine.
I
Do
think
you know
that,
if you haven't found any other areas, any other
So,
towns in Maine that
yes.
have adopted this?
we haven't. And I asked the state and Southern Maine to see if they were familiar with communities that had. My understanding is that, like your growth area, so you have your growth area, you have your transition area, you have your rural area. This is another area you can designate and establish, your own regulations for that area. Limit the number of building permits for residential uses similar to other growth area districts. That's my understanding. It's separate from the current use program. That's something that parcels, I think there's one or two properties, maybe in Kennebunkport, that do participate in that program, but that would be separate and something that, the individual property owner would take on themselves. So we could certainly look into this more if the town, if the committee is interested in it. When we were going through the Chapter 208 requirements and thinking about the growth areas, and our next question is to ask, if any of those boundaries are changing. We're thinking about how Kennebunkport does have an important waterfront area and is worth designating critical waterfront in order to help protect waterfront, water-dependent uses. So it sounds like maybe a placeholder in that discussion.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we're trying to find ways to protect the waterfront that, in lieu of putting a house, I mean, if a person owns, like, again, I'll refer back to where I lived, if somebody owns it, they're managing their work on their property. They may have lobster traps, they're doing whatever on there, you start looking at, people building docks, which is fine, because working right on the coast, ledge and everything else is impossible. I mean, I did lobstering too. It's, you got to have a workbench, so you're putting the stuff somewhere. I think I don't know how if somebody's going to sell a place and build a house, it is what it is, in my opinion. I think we need to, in order to serve the commercial fishing industry, which I definitely want to do, we need to figure out ways and how we continue to enhance, what we have. Work that, what
I
we
like
have
the
to
right to
advocate
fish
for us.
ordinance.
I think what you need to look at first is identify how many properties do you have, that fit into that classification, outside of the municipally owned ones.
Right.
I think that's, because you could be creating something that doesn't, really exist, or looking to protect something that, that doesn't really exist. So
Gordon, how many calls are you getting, people complaining about people getting up early and wanting to go to work down there? I honestly, I know I sound absurd, but, these people going and starting their boats up and they're working hard to get lobsters and whatever else to put on other people's tables. It seems absurd that we would have to have that kind of an ordinance, but.
I mean, I honestly, I don't get any calls for that.
Okay.
I get a lot of other bizarre calls, but not, not about the fishermen firing up their boats in the morning.
No, I mean, I thought that's what drew people to this area, because they're moving here because that's what they want. Yeah.
I've had people complain about dredge activities, happening, like at 2 a.m, because they're working with the tide. But that's about it, relative to waterfront noise.
So what's the sense of the committee? Are we going to leave this this paragraph about right to fish in the comp plan, or you'd like to see it out?
I don't know. I mean, is it really a problem? I mean, how many people are calling complaining about, boats firing up and, the smell of fish? I don't know.
I feel that it's better to have it in than not to have it in. It's when you don't put it in that you're open to
Exactly, Janet.
enormous consequences.
Yeah. And I guess I got to remind everybody that what's in the comp plan is really a recommendation.
Right.
Whether you actually pull the trigger, that's the next step.
It gives you an option.
Yeah, if you do want to pull the trigger and it's not in the comp plan, then you can be subject to legal challenge.
Exactly.
Or the boat firing up for 24 hours.
Well, they turned that noise off at the lighthouse.
Okay.
Quick question, Werner, you might know the answer to. I'm thinking of new types of commercial fishing. I certainly wouldn't want to see a salmon farm off of the Bush property. But I know that I know that oyster fishing can be very, very beneficial for water quality. It helps knock down excess nitrogen from our green lawns, keeps algae under control. And I know somebody got approval. I don't know whether he's in business or not. The Board of Selectmen seemed very supportive of his activity. He had gotten, I don't know, a DEP or some kind of a federal permit to do it, and then they had to okay it as well. Was there anything that was a barrier for him to do that? I have no idea where he did it and whose waters he was in. But, like oyster fishing is becoming incredibly profitable and, beneficial to the state. People are coming for our oysters now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, I wasn't directly involved with that. I wasn't directly involved with that, with that proposition, that project.
Uh-huh.
But I do, I think that the current plan does have supportive language for aquaculture. And so, and that's a big, broad definition.
Yeah.
You can put a lot of stuff into the definition of aquaculture, and so I do think that, you likely want to continue to be supportive of that, but I think you also want to have language in there that, ensures that, it's done in a sustainable, and correct fashion. But yeah, I haven't had any folks looking to put in a salmon farm or anything.
How does that work?
Anything like that.
How does that work?
What do you mean?
Describe a salmon farm. How would that work?
Oh, you put in these huge pens, and there's one being proposed for, I was up at Acadia, and right off of the national park, there's this enormous project being proposed, and, there are lawn signs for 50 miles opposing it.
Yeah, not everybody loves them.
Not everybody loves them.
Oh,
Well,
what's the disadvantage of it?
the traditional problems have been, A, are they going to intermix with the real salmon, our salmon from here? B, they conventionally have had to, they feed them, they don't feed them what salmon regularly eat. They feed them all kinds of other things. They have to traditionally ply them with antibiotics because they're in closed pens. So you have all that drifting around. So the local fishermen generally are not really keen to have them added into the mix, whereas, oysters are much less, for example, you don't add anything. They just sit there and you have to designate an area. I'm sure they can create their own conflict in terms of an area a lobsterman might have been in or passing through or whatever.
Yeah.
My recollection was that the Marine Resources chapter, and Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, does talk about aquaculture.
Yeah, that's what Warren was just saying. Yeah.
I'm
going to make a note just to look at it again.
Yeah, so we can look at it again and just keep in mind that we haven't gone through any of the strategies for any of the chapters yet.
Right.
So something like that might end up being a strategy related to the Marine Resources chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's
and everything that is coming up in this conversation now related to future land use isn't all inclusive of all of the recommendations on all types of land uses throughout the plan. So
I think now that we're speaking of this, I think of like the depleted shrimp industry and the restrictions that are put on shrimpers where they can't even go out and make a living. I wonder if that will morph into something where we see shrimp that's being cultivated in cold water systems. So I think it's important to something that may not be acceptable now, like the salmon, maybe 10 years down the road, there's some other technology that makes it worthwhile. Worthy of noting the other chapter.
So we've got a little bit more in this chapter, Paul, if we could do that.
Yep. We're going back, or we're going.
Yeah, we're going to go back. And this isn't a fully prepared section yet. But Tom's going to scroll back to the start. So we basically in this future land use chapter, there's certain things that we'll need to summarize. These bullet points are kind of a combination of some notes, but also the requirements for the growth area, the transition area, and the rural area. So what we need to do is describe and map the current growth area, the transition area, and the rural area. I'm not saying we have to do that tonight. Tom and I will obviously write up some language. Each section, Janet's going to start, and she's going to. Each section will include a brief description of the types and intensities of land uses, proposed land uses. We haven't heard a ton about changes to the current ordinance in terms of land uses that occur in different areas of town, except for some of those new types of uses that, like farmers markets, that sort of thing, that did come up. And we described those in the non-residential use section here. We have to include a summary of different types of the residential density. We had a good discussion at our last meeting on density, and Tom and I have some revisions to make related to density. Basic information like the number of permits available in the growth area, how the different areas relate to the community's vision, whether there are any major municipal capital investments that are needed to support any of the proposed land uses, and then a brief description of the desired development patterns. And I think that Tom and I probably have a pretty good handle on how we'll describe these areas based on the input we have received. But what we don't know is if you would like to consider modifying any of the boundaries of your current growth and transition and rural areas. And I will see if I can pull up just a quick PowerPoint that has a bunch of the maps that came up in this chapter, just so we can kind of scroll through them quickly. Not 100% sure I'm going to be able to share anything.
I'll be able to do that this momentarily. Let's see. Share screen, PowerPoint. How's this looking?
Good.
Okay, a lot faster than me. I don't know why I'm not able to share. So these are, first slide here is, these are the current growth, transition in rural areas. And just for, I think most of the participants tonight are folks who have been at other meetings, but just in case you're not familiar with the growth area concept, is that basically these areas were identified in the last comprehensive plan based on multiple factors, but primarily the extent of sewer and water, as well as existing development. And essentially there are different numbers of permits for new residential development available in each of these three zones, with more permits being available in growth areas and the least number of permits available in rural areas. And in the past, it hasn't been a huge issue because the town hasn't really maxed out on the number of permits that it issues in any of these areas. But this is the opportunity to take a look at the areas and see if any boundaries require modification. So I think that maybe we'll just kind of skim through the maps pretty quickly, and then we're interested in your input on these boundaries. So this is an overlay of those boundaries shown in the dark black lines on the zoning districts in Kennebunkport. And I think this is an important map to see because it shows that, one, I think the most obvious thing here is that the growth area boundaries don't align with the zoning districts, and there's no requirement that your growth areas need to align with your zoning districts. But let's say you did want to incentivize, denser development in a specific zone in town. You have a few different zones here that are present in all three different growth areas. And so if you, let's say and I know we're not going to necessarily make recommendations now on minimizing your lot size in the free enterprise zone, but if you did do that, you're not necessarily encouraging development in your growth area, because the free enterprise zone exists in all three different in your growth rate areas. So in some ways, by not aligning with your zoning ordinance, you're maybe limiting your ability to influence where future residential development could occur.
Isn't free enterprise, correct me if I'm wrong, free enterprise means that I can live in my house, but have the opportunity to, say, run a business out of my garage?
That's a slightly different concept. So that would be, I think, a home occupation, and Werner, correct me if I'm wrong. So free enterprise is the name of the zoning district. And so what the free enterprise district, as well as each of these other colored areas, have is a set of regulations that identify like the minimum lot size, all those dimensional standards that we talked about at the last meeting, as well as the types of uses that are allowed. And home occupation is considered, I believe in Kennebunkport, as a type of use. And so that type of use could be allowed in, and I believe it is allowed in most different districts in town. So free enterprise is just the name of that area.
Jim, just for example, if you compare the Cape Arundel zoning district, which is down on the bottom, and then the free enterprise, the land use ordinance would allow you more options for commercial use in the free enterprise than in Cape Arundel. So it's not necessarily home occupation, but there are other things you could do to your property that are non-residential. But,
Yeah. For most folks, it's important to recognize, free enterprise is really very much of a mixed use zone.
Right.
I think that most folks would be surprised if they read the table in terms of, the kind of broad number of uses that could show up in both free enterprise and farm and forest. It's a pretty big list. It's not, I would tell you that the majority of the uses that are listed in those tables, are not necessarily in those zones. I think, from what I understood, many of those uses showed up in the ordinance primarily in order to get zoning passed back in the 70s to begin with. They threw a lot of things in there that people say, well, I might want to do this, and I might want to do that, regardless of whether or not they actually were ever going to do it. I think it seems like there was this overwhelming thought about wanting to make sure that their rights to potentially do something like that were preserved. But again, a lot of those uses, and we've talked about this, because of our non-proximity to Route 1 and the highway, don't necessarily make a lot of sense from a market perspective. One, the land is too expensive for a lot of those larger scale, industrial or commercial uses. And it's just, it's not super practical because there's more developable land, closer to Route 1 and Route 95 than the land that you have here. So I think that's what's kept a lot of those uses from showing up in town. But I think what's been discussed in the past is looking at those uses and making recommendations as to, whether or not we actually want those, in town, and, whether or not those tables should be modified.
Yeah.
Warner, can you give me some examples of, what kind of use that would be?
Yeah. Let me.
We had a slide in one of our, I can see if I can find it, in our public, I think it was the Future Land Use Workshop, that had images of a lot of the different types of uses.
Yeah.
So I can look for that and or send that
Yes.
out.
So for example, free, in free enterprise, you could have, I'm just going to pull a couple of them, up here. You could have commercial center, commercial complexes, commercial recreation indoor, commercial recreation outdoor, community buildings, elder care, extractive industries, financial institutions, funeral home, golf course, kennel, library, manufacturing, nursing home, commercial parking, professional business offices, So again, I'm not reading all of them, but I'm just kind of going through and grabbing a couple. So,
None of it ever happened.
Well, right.
It's probably for the reasons why Warner said. It's just doesn't seem practical to be that far off the, main Route 1 or something.
Right. But I do think it's important to look at those and say, well, I don't know, do we really want, manufacturing, for example, and maybe what you look at is you look at it from the perspective of saying, well, all right, so we probably don't want a 50,000 square foot, warehouse with manufacturing, but, to to Jim's point. So, all right. So if somebody has 1,500 square feet and they want to employ, 10, 15 people,
Making T-shirts or something,
Right, right.
some small footprint.
Right. Like something like that. All right. Well, maybe that's not so, that's not so bad, in that regard. But you don't necessarily have you don't have performance standards here that dictates it that specifically. Again,
Yeah.
is it likely that somebody's going to come in and say, I want to build,
Walmart Supercenter.
right. I want to put an Amazon warehouse right here, doesn't make a lot of sense, from a business perspective.
Not for the trucks, but maybe if they're doing drones.
Some cities and towns are competing for the Amazon warehouse.
Right. But it doesn't change the fact that, that there's a path in the ordinance to get there if, somebody decides that they want to make a go of it. So,
yeah.
So why don't we include that as a recommendation to take a look at the permitted uses in those two districts? Because that's come up a couple times now, and I don't feel like we got a ton of input during the public workshop about the types of permitted uses. So, I'd be hesitant to make any recommendations on what should and shouldn't be there. But definitely a good look at those uses is probably.
I see a survey in our future.
a survey.
I think that's a great way to handle it.
Yeah.
It should
I
be
think so.
should be looked at.
It's not invasive, but it'll pull some good information from folks.
It's an excellent idea, Janet.
Yeah.
Yeah. First question is, would you like a kennel next door to you?
well, and
That's our dog.
some of the
Not on
things
my property. I don't care if it makes money.
That's a
Some
good
of the-
question.
some items need to be looked at and I think just modernized as well, so
Yeah.
in that same section in farm and forest, for example, it has, a conditional use subject to going to ZBA, handcrafts. I mean, who wants to, is that really something, is handcrafts something that you think needs to go through a zoning board of appeals process?
It would not seem so.
Would not seem so.
It depends if they're busy or not.
But that's kind of what I referred to, like, working out of your garage. That, there's such an extreme from a huge warehouse to something like that. It's such an extreme.
Right. Well, and so let's take the working, the working out of your garage example. If somebody's going to really do that as a home occupation, then, arguably under the current ordinance, they need to go through the ZBA and get approved as a home occupation, in order to do that. If you're going to do that, if that's something that you want to do,
At your residence.
at your house, and you're going to be making a living at it. If, you got your buddy's truck over and you guys are wrenching together for the night, I don't want to hear about it.
We should, because we picked on short-term rentals enough. We should make sure we're doing the right thing for all these other businesses.
Liz, I like your suggestion, and I think we should just do that and say we should take a look at it and evaluate it not in the context between the next 4 months, because I don't think we can or should do that, but to say as a strategy, it should be looked at and evaluated.
Okay.
Now, what about Janet's idea about sending out a poll?
Well, I don't think that's part of, I think that's a recommendation that goes in the recommendations.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think
I don't
at this
need to do
point-
it for this at this point in the writing
Right.
of the comp plan.
Okay.
Right.
Or
I agree.
revising.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, before we leave this map, Werner, you stepped up for a couple minutes, but Liz posed an important question: is the zoning districts don't align with the growth districts, and one disadvantage of that is it's hard to tweak density in any one growth area when the zoning is, transcends the boundaries there. So, do you see that as a problem? And if so, should we be moving any of these boundaries around?
Well, I think I think you have to step back and look at, why the zoning boundaries are the way they are, and recognize that, your growth area map is it's a rate of growth. We did those lines initially based on the presence of infrastructure and not necessarily along the lines of the zoning districts. So, the question is, do you want your, maybe that's the other question. Do you want your zones to follow your infrastructure? I don't know. I guess the short answer is that I don't know that, that you want to realign them based on the zone boundaries, because I think the two things, indicate two different items.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And the flip side of the coin is, do you want to realign your zoning boundaries to align with the growth areas?
Yeah, I think, I'd be interested to hear the committee's thoughts on that. But I think that anytime there's a discussion about moving zoning boundaries, people get really nervous.
Yeah,
that for whatever reason.
I think that's definitely needs more work item,
Right.
Moving the zoning boundaries, but it's definitely something that we could put in as something to look at. But the growth boundaries, that it's an interesting issue, I think, and some communities do align their growth areas with their zoning districts, and a lot of those communities like that have significantly more zoning districts than we do. And I think that makes it a lot easier to align them. We have our zoning districts, look at Farm and Forest, it's huge. Right.
And so, I think if you were, a lot of other communities, you'd probably have, you'd have a dozen more, you'd have about a dozen more, different zoning districts. And so, I think it's probably more important to have, to think of the concept of maybe overlays and exemptions for specific types of, development that you want to be, that you want to have outside of, that are impacted by, the growth areas, if you're looking at it as a negative aspect. But
Warner, you bring up a good point. Does that zoning board of appeals allow for variances in different zones? Like, say, for the Farm and Forest, if I said, hey, I want to build a t-shirt shop, can I get a variance for that to be considered a free enterprise parcel?
so no, the short answer on that is no.
Okay.
The ZBA doesn't do
Variances?
There's not a use variance. When they look at variances, it's more for dimensional requirements, or they're looking at, administrative, they're doing more administrative appeals.
Okay.
But in Farm and Forest, if you wanted to make T-shirts, you could do so. Manufacturing's a use, so.
I would like to continue the alignment of these zones with infrastructure. If and when we solve the problem of why our beach, which is the jewel in the crown of the town, has consistently high, elevated levels of pollution, and all of which we have two rivers which flow into our beach and affect our beach environment. When we solve that problem and we get clean readings all summer long, then I would say, infrastructure isn't so important. But the sewage is coming from someplace.
Yeah.
Do you want to go to the next slide?
Mm-hmm.
That one will show, again, your growth growth areas in the black line. Red is the sewer lines. Orange is the area within 100 feet or 1,000 feet of sewer. The kind of periwinkle color, small area of that in the north end of town is the higher yield aquifer in town. It's a pretty limited area. And then the pale yellow is the drinking water service area, although not everyone in that area is on public water. So this is another layer to consider when looking at the growth areas. And as Werner mentioned, this was used in the past to identify the growth management areas. You can see that there aren't any parcels in the rural area that aren't on municipal sewer. So one item that Dan mentioned at the last meeting, I believe, was I think something to the effect of, and again, we'll want to confirm this with him, that he liked the language in the comp plan that supported the alignment of growth areas based on the sewer area and the potential sewer area. And I think that's something that, Paul, you mentioned that you support, these areas aligned with sewer areas. I think it would be good to get just confirmation from other growth planning committee members that you are supportive of that language, just so we know whether to carry it over from the 2012 plan. There's some language about land within 1,000 feet of the sewer lines being, in growth areas. So the sense that I'm getting is that folks are generally supportive of kind of keeping the growth boundary based on the sewer lines, which is how they were identified to begin with. But just a confirmation from those who are present that that aligns with your feelings.
Yeah. I'm supportive of that, Liz.
Thanks, Janet.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I mean, even looking at it from, when we go back to the scenarios of, somebody referenced like owning a business, even if it's a dog kennel, operating and building the infrastructure, or even a t-shirt shop that has 15 people, the cost of building a huge septic system or having a well, it makes more sense to do it closer to a sewer line or water. It would be more cost effective owning a business that way. I can't imagine doing that. The additional cost to do it further away from that. But it makes sense.
I do want to be clear that the growth areas are not, they're not at all defining what uses you can and can't have in different areas of town.
Right.
They're regulating the number of residential permits that are available in any given year, with the basic goal being that the town would issue, if there was a huge demand for residential development, the town would be issuing more in the growth areas than in up to a certain threshold than in the rural areas. But your logic applies, I think, to residential development also being easier on your natural resources where you have existing infrastructure than in areas in the north and west side of town that don't have that infrastructure.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. I agree with.
Okay, so we'll get some language in about the growth, growth areas continuing to align with sewer lines. We have a couple more maps. Should I keep scrolling through them, Paul?
Yeah, I think we can go for a few more minutes. We're
Okay.
almost at 8, but why don't we just try to get
Okay.
through this?
Okay,
Is
so
that okay,
this,
guys?
Yep, that's fine.
Yeah.
this map we did look at, again, we're looking at the town-owned land that's conserved,
Right.
not conserved, town forest land, which is not conserved, 2 parcels called town forest that aren't conserved, the location of other municipal infrastructure, that sort of thing, with sort of the goal of showing that in these growth areas where you're encouraging more residential development, those are the locations where you have more sidewalk infrastructure, more crosswalks, more amenities, and for residents. Tom, you can skip the next slide because we already went over those sea level rise maps. We looked at this one as well at our last meeting, looking at of the land that is just of the properties that are just land and not developed. This is the town assessing classification of developable, potentially developable, and likely undevelopable land. So
What's likely undevelopable?
The yellow parcels,
Yeah.
for various reasons. I think the wetlands, I think, were one of the reasons that that the land's classified that way.
Oh, okay.
Really tiny lots, I think I read.
Yeah, it looks like some of
Another-
those don't have any street access.
Some
So
of it, but some
You
of
always
it,
get a neat.
yeah, and again, this is based on assessing data, so it's not an exact science here, but it's just to give you a general idea of where there are parcels that don't have an existing home or commercial use that aren't conservation land. Where are those locations?
Okay, that's not conservation land?
I don't think there's any conservation land in here.
Do we
Fine.
source this?
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jim.
Nope, no, go ahead, Paul.
I was just going to say, because I think that what Jim is asking is a question that many people will say, well, what's undevelopable land? So I just think someplace we need to say this is based upon assessing data, and that answers the question.
Yeah, because the
Anyway.
land. Go ahead, Paul. Sorry.
No, if anybody wants to know, then they go to talk to the tax assessor and they find out.
Yeah, because a landlocked piece of property, I mean, if you want to build a house, somebody's got to allow you. It just all depends on how much you got to pay to get it in there.
Yeah. Okay. Next, Tom. Thank you. This one we already looked at also. This is some natural resources that we are, want to account for when you are designating the growth, rural, and transition areas. Chapter 208 has some requirements like not having very large blocks of undeveloped land in your transition or growth areas, things like that. I think in general the boundaries line up pretty well with respect to not having large undeveloped areas in your growth and transition areas. One of those large undeveloped areas is the village parcel. There's a couple in the transition zone that are fairly large looking blocks of undeveloped land. But nothing jumped out as, really needing to be moved out of transition into rural, looking at this information. Farmland soils, just to clarify, doesn't mean that that's the only location of the farm. It's just the classification of the soil. And then the last map is a little hodgepodgey looking, but one of the other things that we need to look at is the zoning the growth areas in designation in adjacent communities. So here are your neighboring communities. Biddeford's map is actually their zoning map, and they have a rural zoning district, which is that pale yellow color that covers large areas of Biddeford, and that's what they call rural. The rest of their districts are growth. But you can see, and this map obviously doesn't line up perfectly. The northern end of Kennebunkport is rural areas, and so that is directly adjacent to Biddeford's rural area. So that's a good thing. There's no major conflicts there. This state likes to see buffers of some sort. Let's say if Biddeford did have a commercial area right next to, not a commercial area, a growth area right next to your rural area. And the same goes for Arundel. That map's a little bit hard to read, but there's a really light shaded area that is the town's growth area. And then the green portion of Kennebunk is the growth area, and yellow is transition, and the pale yellow is rural in Kennebunkport. So I guess the takeaway message there is that none of the current designations in Kennebunkport really conflict with neighboring designations.
That's good.
That is good.
So I guess.
Go ahead, Liz.
I guess so far we haven't heard any major cry to change the growth areas.
Seems so.
If that's if it's all right, then we'll just kind of proceed with writing up the descriptions for each of those areas based on the currently designated growth, transition, and rural areas.
I'll send a note to Jim, the folks who weren't here tonight, and copy you. And if anybody wants to speak to that, they'll let you know. Otherwise,
okay,
I think.
Great. That's helpful, yeah.
There are some more chat comments, which I've sort of promised I would go through. Not if they're duplicative, I won't, but if they're original, I will, given the time. We didn't get through chapters 1 through 17 review. We'll have to do that next time. Is there anything else you want us to focus on tonight, Liz, Tom?
I just had one question for the committee. One of the last comments that come in says, please share all comments before you close.
Right. That's what I was referring to.
Okay.
So I'll do that.
All right.
We're going to have some I know we're running out of time. A couple of things that I wanted to, wording wise, should I just send those after the fact? On this chapter?
Yeah.
Do that. We're not finished with the chapter, so we can incorporate your recommendations and go over them when we bring the chapter back.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What's the date of our next meeting? It's a regular.
Be the first Tuesday of December.
I don't have a calendar out.
That would be the
I would
7th.
assume the
It would be
30th.
December 7th.
7th.
And as I recall, we have a meeting with the selectmen 2 days after that.
That's correct. Yeah, that's the the last time we discussed the meeting on the 9th with the selectmen.
Good.
Yes, we talked about doing an update. Kind of a high level update to them as far as progress.
But we'll still go ahead with the 7th, just for a regular meeting, just to move ahead.
Yeah. So Tom and Liz, I think it'll be good for us to touch base outside of this, just on what that wants to look like for the 9th.
Mm-hmm.
We typically want to make sure that whatever is going to be presented, we want to have that in advance, and get that to the town manager so that can get put in the meeting packets for the selectmen.
probably be a good idea to have that meeting sooner rather than later, Werner, huh?
Yeah. So we
We'll
can,
be in touch with you on that, yeah.
sounds good. Yeah.
And are we meeting on the 21st of December? Just for calendar sake? What do people think?
At least jot it in, yeah. I think,
Good if people are available.
yeah.
I think you're allowed to make cookies during that if you.
I thought
Me
that was our
too.
Secret Santa meeting.
Can I drink
Eggnog.
eggnog?
I think we're a little behind schedule, so I would say if it's okay
Yeah,
with
we
Tom and
need-
Liz, we should go ahead and do it.
Sure.
Yeah, I think we should.
I agree.
Okay, let me go back to the, thanks. Let me go back to the, most of the chat we've gone through, but I'm going to incentivize various types of small-scale development among year-round residents, protect our farm and forest. I'd like to support a home business, and dog kennel is one that I say would be a good job, same as boat starting early in the morning. Everyone has a right to use their talents, I guess, in their town. It shouldn't be not in my backyard in the free enterprise. I would want to make sure we encourage home occupations and encourage creativity. And I guess what Werner said, basically, so many things are allowed in free enterprise that we've already taken care of that by the current comp plan. But if we look at it, we're obviously mindful of this comment. I would like to support a home business. Oh, I think that's this. Yep. How many people were here tonight? We had 15 or 16 total, which includes the 6 of us. 1, 2. So how many are we? We were 3 committee members plus Werner plus you guys. So maybe 10 others.
6. The participant list says 9 panelists and 6 attendees.
Okay.
So I think
How
the
we get-
panelists include
They include our tech men.
tech,
Okay, that's
couple
fine.
tech. Yeah.
Great. We don't mind that, Dave. All right. Anything else before I ask for a motion to adjourn?
Minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
We need to approve the minutes from the 9th. Was that a motion, Jim?
Yeah, I motion that we approve the minutes.
I'll second it. All in favor, raise your little pinky. I see 3 pinkies. We approve the minutes. Thank you. We've got our dates for the next meetings. Anything else before we close? Okay. So,
I think it's great that folks are tuning in and they're participating, and I just love it. It's
yeah, thanks for coming,
so
guys.
helpful. We appreciate all of you being
Paul, I have
involved.
one quick comment.
Sure.
For growth planning committee members, we had comments from Dan on the vision chapter, and we have a number of comments that Tom and I previously forwarded a draft response to, but if anyone between now and the next meeting has additional comments that they want to send in advance on the past chapters, then please feel free to do so. We'll try to get through those comments in an expedited manner.
And just to be clear, that applies to the public as well.
Yeah, so anyone from the public, chapters 1 through 17, which are available on the comp plan website. It took me 2 days. My wife said, I've never seen you sit so still in your life.
You're
when I went-
sitting for the bar exam or getting ready to take the bar.
Right. But I thought annotating them and sending back to us was a great idea to help move it faster when we go through it next time.
And Paul, you had some great comments.
Whatever. All right. Night, everybody.
Night.
Night, everyone.
You need a motion?
We'll take a motion, sure.
I'll take a motion that everybody has a great Thanksgiving and we adjourn the meeting.
Amen. I think we're all in favor of that.
We are.
Take care.
Bye.
Good night,
Night.
everyone.
Thanks, Dave.